Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Camden. We're gathering here for a 5v1 on pro and anti-borders. Personally, from Cincinnati, Ohio, firm Wellman supporter, very pro-border. And I'll let everyone else introduce themselves.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ben. I'm born in Fargo, North Dakota, and I will be the solo person for Cole today.
Everybody, I'm Will from Ohio, and I am in support of Wellman.
Hello, everybody. I'm Itai Velosny, and I'm from Closter, New Jersey, and I'm in support of Wellman's argument.
Hi, everybody. I'm Matthew Wu. I'm from Barrington, Illinois, and I'm in support of Wellman.
Hi, I'm Amelia Cordova. I'm from Minnesota and I'm in support of Wellman.
All right. And then just to preface, we're us five here, Wellman supporters, we're standing on his core argument that a legitimate state has a presumptive right to exclude based on political self-determination and freedom of association.
And I will be standing on Cole's counter argument that the right to exclude conflicts with the liberal principle that all people are morally equal, even if everyone has equal moral worth, then it is hard to justify denying people entry simply because of where they were born.
All right, well, I'll just kick it off. I'll present the first point here. So my point is kind of core to Wellman. It's kind of his foundation, and it's that legitimate states are entitled to political self-determination. And this grants them like a sphere of group autonomy over internal self-regarding matters. And with that, sovereign states have moral dominion over their own affairs, and controlling who enters, who becomes a member, and stuff like that is definitively just part of that self-determination.
I think that's a great point. The right to exclude is not merely self-regarding, though. It is deeply other-regarding because it directly affects the lives and rights of those who are excluded. More importantly, uh, it begs the question, it assumes from the start that the distinction between members and non-members is morally legitimate, and then uses that assumption to justify a right to exclude. In other words, I'm saying that it presumes the very point it is supposed to prove, namely that member groups' claim to self-determination gives it the moral authority to exclude outsiders.
Yeah, I'd just like to jump in here and say that the critique of begging the question rests entirely on assuming that the legitimacy condition is insufficient. Wellman's right only applies to states that first meet the moral threshold.
Yeah,
Let's
just
see.
to bring up our second point here. Freedom of association is vital for self-determination. A collective body, like a state, cannot be the author of its own future if it cannot determine who the self is. If citizens who care deeply about their country's culture, economy, or political profile, they must have the presumptive right to choose whom to admit, just like any club has the right to exclude to preserve its character.
So I like that point. The analogy between states and voluntary associations like golf clubs or marriages fails because liberalism treats exit and entry very differently. When someone leads a club, they step into a safe external place where they can continue their life without serious restriction or worry. But leaving a state can mean becoming stateless, a dangerous condition in which basic life plans cannot be pursued. For the right to leave a state to have real meaning, there must also be a universal right to enter another state. Without this, the liberal commitment to freedom of movement is ethically inconsistent, which basically what I'm saying is if they don't have another place to go, morally, is it okay for them to leave, to not be allowed in?
That's a good point, but Miller addressed that the right to leave is an opportunity right, and it holds as long as most people would get offers from at least one state. So it doesn't necessitate a universal right to enter. So I'm going to move on to my next point, and Wellman's point is that to protect self-determination, the state's right must apply to individual immigrants, not just other states. A single immigrant may be insignificant, but a sufficient number could severely impact the country's future direction. If a hostile power could simply flood a country with immigrants until they could vote the native citizens out, which is including the Lithuania example, it denies the state control over individual entry and destroys self-determination in the long run.
I understand that, but this ignores the moral arbitrariness of birth, where someone is born on one side of the border or another is a matter of luck, not by choice. like natural talents or social background. It is a moral, arbitrary starting point and should not be determined a person's life changes or basic rights. Basing the fair distribution of resources and opportunities on national membership, therefore, grounds justice and something that has no moral relevance at all.
I think that's a good point you make there. And yeah, birth is arbitrary. I'll give you that. But Wellman contends that arbitrariness it can be overcome if people choose to be members. For instance, when people are staying when they're past 18, maybe you can't go before you're 18 because of your parents. But if you're staying past 18, you're you're allowing yourself to be there. You're giving that consent to be there. You're becoming a member in that sense, and that's when that autonomy begins. Um, and just with that, I think that choice justifies the priority of insider rights over outsider rights. Yes.
Okay, moving on to our next point of the legitimacy condition. I just want to say, Ben, you keep raising examples of historical abuses. Wellman's legitimacy condition is the ethical safeguard to this. Only states that adequately protect and respect human rights are entitled to the right to exclude. So this criteria rolls out illegitimate states such as Nazi Germany. It gives the state the right to choose its members while precluding exclusions based on racist or morally arbitrary criteria like race, religion, or gender.
I see what you're saying, but Wellman actually admits himself that it is surprisingly difficult to give a fully satisfying explanation for why a state with unilateral right to exclude could not discriminate on morally repugnant grounds. His story references this concern. Colonialism and racially motivated immigration laws show that states often misuse exclusionary power. The only reliable way to prevent racist exclusion is to recognize a universal right not to be discriminated against, one that limits a state's right to exclude, but this is exactly the move Wellman rejects.
Yeah, that makes sense, but I think to rebuttal that, I believe we don't need a theoretical justification if the legitimacy criterion practically prevents abuse. The point is the right to exclude. The point is the right to exclude exists. How it's exercised is a separate, though critical, moral matter.
Moving on to our next point about consequentialist distinction. Well, your focus on global inequality is valid, but Wellman says global justice obligations need not to be paid in the currency of open borders. Rich states can meet their duties through resource transfers or aid to global poor where they live. Unilateral control over immigration is an efficient way to manage these resources and address global poverty directly without compromising the state's self-determination.
I understand that, but this position treats wealthy nations as the ones who get to pick and choose what they want, either to offer aid or allow immigration. That framing reveals the deeper problem that the main injustice is not just unequal distribution of the resources they have, but unequal power relations that allow all powerful states to unilaterally control the global migration system and dominate the weaker states. A just approach to migration, therefore, requires multilateral governance, not unilateral control by the most powerful countries or states.
I'd just like to add, though, that multilateral governance doesn't necessarily rule out the right to exclude. It just changes who is exercising that right.
Very good point. All right, so very good arguments presented from everyone. Really liked them. I just like to highlight some really good points people made really quick. I did really like Ben, your argument about how
Mm-hmm.
the right to exclude's not self-regarding. I thought that was a good point, and I liked the rebuttal there too about the begging the question. Great points there. You know, you almost had me. I'm not gonna lie. Um, then then I'll go on to the next though. I do really like um I know Matthew, you brought up how freedom of association is vital, and then Ben, you came back and were talking about like entry and exit. And I
Yeah,
think that's a valid point to bring up is that tie between entry and exit's important. But I think that the rebuttal there that was made was very good about like most people get offers from at least one other state. Just like to highlight that point. I think that's a core one.
I
Really,
agree. I agree. I want to pitch into that too as well. The only thing is, how do we know that they're going to get an offer from one other state, and how do we know like the distance it takes to get to that other state? There's a lot of factors that we can't put into this equation, I guess you could
Yeah.
say. But I just would like to point that out as well.
Yeah, I think there's so I mean, I if I were to say anything, I think you handled that 5v1 very well. Your rebuttals were great. I think kind of ended on a neutral zone there. There's definitely a lot of questions in the air, a lot more that could be explored, but I think that was a really good job of kind of like highlighting some key issues in that argument, some rebuttals to that, and some rebuttals to those rebuttals. I think good job, everyone.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where everybody's had a rebuttal to my rebuttal. So great
I
work
mean,
by you
yeah,
guys.
everyone had some good points today. That was great.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys.
Yep.
Yep, thank y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.